Birmingham, and between the ages of 12 and 18, I went to, those of you who know Birmingham, a King Edward school. It was days of the 11 plus and scholarships to do things like that, which put me into the elite, having not come from the elite of society of Birmingham, basically. So that's why I became political at such a young age, is the shock of that transition. And also got involved with Irish politics at that time, which was very relevant in Birmingham. And also connected to that, we had Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech while I was a teenager. And yes, I was there and I was arrested, protesting at that particular speech. So I started really young, and people have been talking about how they started really young. And was involved in lots of protests. And that went on until in Edinburgh, this is between the ages of 18 and 27, I moved to Edinburgh to university. And as well, while at university, I got involved in housing, transport, all sorts of campaigns, and second wave feminism. So the talk yesterday, I knew all about second wave feminism, I didn't really know much about third wave, and that was absolutely fascinating for me. But I was there in second wave feminism and ended up chairing the Women's Committee of Edinburgh District Council. Fairly obviously I was a councillor at a relatively young age, in particular in those days. And as a councillor, as well as chairing the Women's Committee, I changed the structure and the way politics was done in that committee by opening it up and making it less conflictual, or trying to make it less conflictual. So I challenged some of the way of doing politics, and that's what I was really proud of, as well as coping with all the things that happen. And those of you who are involved in politics, mainstream politics, know that things like my being threatened with being kneecapping won't even shock you, because that sort of thing was normal in the way of conflictual politics. And male politics were involved in alternative things during the miners' strike with women. It was called Women Supporting the Miners' Strike, but women's politics around that. But we also did things like went out and got women to think about why there was such a problem about the number of women dying of cervical cancer, because the screening service was so bad. So we didn't just provide services. It was not a responsibility of Edinburgh District Council to do cervical screening. But we went out and, thank you, got women to get involved in campaigning. I was very proud of that, and got different people involved with that. So way back in 1984, I was trying to change the way politics are doing things, and also referring to yesterday, my little sheep at that time had I'm part of the Cuddly Left t-shirt. Yeah, so I remember Labour Party meetings with the Cuddly Left t-shirt as well. Just sort of throw that in. Then when I was in the, and also as part of that, we're involved in the poll tax, and as I say, trying to get, I'll move this over here, women realising that politics is important. And one thing is, I didn't realise how much was done during the time that I took a position of authority or power, whatever, until other people told me about it. And that's something that I've heard other people say: you don't realise you're doing very much, you're constantly frustrated, you're not doing enough, we want to change the world and look after animals and everything else. And I'm certainly guilty of that. And one of the things to remember is people who now talk about that time in Edinburgh cheer me up and give me hope, because there was things that happened that they still remember. Whether or not they remember it was anything to do with me is beside the point. I don't care. I only care things happened. And I still see that happening. So I'm still really enthusiastic many years later, skipping over the bit in between because I've only got 10 minutes. And I wanted to talk particularly about relationships, because that's this session. So now I concentrate mostly on informal community education around politics, and trying to counteract the idea that politics is boring. Obviously I don't think it is. I haven't given up, despite all of that. And this is me organising a trip down to London to Million Women Rise, which we've seen 2 photos of already. And I took a group of women on a trip out to London. they really didn't care what it was to go to. They wanted to go on a trip to London. I'm not slightest bit ashamed of manipulating it that way. And a lot of these women didn't have confidence to go out on their own, and certainly wouldn't join anything political. They came because they knew and liked me as a community worker. So I had them on the bus, and I'm really pleased that afterwards they said they didn't expect it to be fun, particularly the politics bit, but actually they really loved it. So that's just a group of women from Smethwick on their way to London. Another group from Sparkbrook, a section of Birmingham. We did link up with the local, well, she's not local MP for that area, that's complicated. The MP for Ladywood, Shabana Mahmood, and we talked about her life and theirs. And in particular, the women asked Shabana about juggling her day-to-day life, her family, etc., the pressures on her, the problems of representing all constituents, particularly as a young South Asian woman, and the pressures on her from the various communities with which she identifies, in particular the pressures from the Asian community to do things for Asian people. We had really good discussions about that and what is frequently called community cohesion, but just how communities tend not to work together. And Shabana being labelled, we looked at identity yesterday a little bit, this idea she was primarily a South Asian woman, or wasn't she? Is she primarily a babe of the Labour Party? All these identities, and it was a superb discussion, and she said she really enjoyed it, as well as the women who found they could talk to her personally. So I'm really pleased that we set that up. But in politics, there certainly are tensions. There we are at the Million Women Rise thing again, which the group from 2 we're going to. And part of politics is, it's not Shabana's got the answers, for example, and neither's anybody else. Politics is a mess, and it's noisy and incoherent, and it's full of all sorts of different ideas that we all want, and impossible demands, and impractical ideas. And so it's, for me, as I said, it's getting more women interested in politics, at whatever level that they want to get involved themselves, because I don't think being an MP should be the aim for everyone who's interested in politics. I actually think at the moment the politics of Britain is in such a mess of disillusionment that there's a much bigger action needed around getting people just to have any interest in politics. So that's the relationships that I'm interested in building, and for me, connecting some of the other things we're talking about, having a partnership between grassroots and politics. So that's my particular interest. And so enabling interest and engagement, and making politics accessible, which I think we're going on to later, and how, for me, taking women for a trip out to London is politics. I also took them to Million Women Rise. It was in their face, but it was still around that. We had music. We have food in all the sessions that I run, because I think that's really important, especially for women, especially chocolate cake. And I think, so it's about enjoying politics and building those relationships. And another thing that I'm involved with is setting up some history tours of Handsworth, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is generally thought of in an area with well-known racial tensions of a good few years ago still. And it's not seen as an area that people would wish to live in or go and visit as a tourist. And we're setting up tourist tours of Handsworth. The we, because I have lots of we's, the we is mixed sex, but one of the things that I'm trying to do is look at the history of Handsworth from a woman's point of view, because in particular Handsworth has got lots of different tensions around things like the men who were very involved in bringing the Industrial Revolution about. A lot of them lived in Handsworth, and they've got quite posh houses, and they could be seen to be civic pioneers, but if you look at the underlying reasoning behind what they did, it was around them making money out of moving their coal, and that's why they built canals, all that sort of thing. But to me, the real interest is while they were doing all of that, women were pushing buggies around the park. And so I'm very interested in how women use things like public spaces. And the parks did come about through civic action and political action, but women still used it differently. So at all times, I'm sort of trying to look at doing politics differently while still doing politics and connecting to everything that's happening. And that fits in with some of the things I did in the past around, for example, women involved in political action in Clydeside at the beginning of the 20th century, which is also frequently forgotten about. And women were very heavily involved in that. And quite often you can find history of what women did, and I've used that a lot in Scotland, where I used to live, very obviously, getting women to look at their own history around Clydeside. So all of that to me is part of, as an adult informal educator, I get folk to think. And to me, politics and democracy is about us thinking and feeling confident and actually having an interest, not feeling obliged to vote, not feeling obliged to go out and do anything, but actually having an interest. And that's what I aim to do through working with groups of people to encourage their interest. And I think it's really important that it's all about partnerships, as I said earlier. And one of the things, as somebody who's no longer young, is I see at the moment a lot of the stuff that's coming out of the government and more generally the dominant way people think is to be very cynical about councillors and politics. And for example, the big thing that the government's doing is called Big Local, one of their big things in the community, which is connected to community organising. And that's really, really says do not touch councillors with barge pole, because it's supposed to be about individual community autonomy. And I worry about that tying in with the idea of a band-aid philosophy that we were talking about before. So much of what we've talked about during these sessions are things we could talk about for ages and which I tried to pick up. And so, finally, this was my conclusion. Sparkbrook, area of Birmingham, I'm very pleased to say, claim they now find politics interesting. They only came along to the sessions because they sort of wanted to know what it was about, but it's really difficult to get them along because the word politics just puts them off. The ones I've managed to get along say they now find it interesting. I dragged the local councillor along, not kicking and screaming, she was quite happy to do, but her attitude towards it changed after I got her to realise how much the women knew and were interested in different things. And what I wanted to say at the end was what she expected was to give things to the women, including knowledge, etc. And it was very paternalistic. And that paternalism, which is part of patriarchy, of course, can be very attractive because you don't need to do anything yourself. You sit back and let somebody else do it. And somebody like that local councillor agrees that she felt that taking on the role of being a councillor involved doing that, doing things for people. And what I got her to do, therefore the critical reflection happened amongst the women there, but also with that councillor, was get her to rethink her role as a political leader in terms of encouraging doing things with people rather than for people, which I think challenges some of the patriarchal, the paternalism involved in mainstream traditional politics. So that's me.